It's been cited as the most important relationship in the world, and with the election transitions now complete, could this mark a new chapter in the US-China relationship? Mulraine from TD Securities joins me now. Millan, the China-US relationship has proven testy at best in the past. Responsible for a third of the world economy, the two countries are now providing ballast internationally as Europe and Japan stagnate. Will new leadership act as a reset button, do you think?
Well, I think it's unlikely at this point. I think what we have to be careful about is understanding the relationship or the nature of that relationship between these two countries. Keep in mind, we are coming from a period of a hegemonic relationship in global politics where U.S.'s influence and reach around the world has been more or less unrivaled since the fall of the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. So essentially, what we do have now is that reach and that influence, both militarily and economically, being challenged by a more assertive China. And in some ways, one can see that as perhaps the evolutionary process in the global economy as a more developed China becomes more assertive economically with its reach in a number of countries across the globe, and militarily, particularly in Asia. I think for now, though, that relationship as it evolves will perhaps be one that, through the maturity, will be one that would be managed, and even though it will be testy at times, will perhaps evolve into a situation where both realize that the global relationship requires stability, and it requires a response from both countries that will avoid any major conflict. As it relates to the leadership in the new leadership in both China and the U.S., I think the biggest change is likely to come on the Chinese side, and that perhaps makes it a bit nervous for the global economy over the next few months, for the simple reason that the new president of China would want to assert his bona fide to the Chinese people, both militarily and also at a time when China's economic growth has slowed considerably. He would perhaps want to show his bona fide on the economic front. That's not necessarily going to go well with the U.S. particularly as it relates to what's going on right now with tensions between Japan. So I think for the very near term, we are likely to see some skirmishes. I think it would be more on the verbal side than any physical skirmish. But I think as both leaders become more entrenched, we're likely to see the kind of stalemate that perhaps would be conducive for the global economy.
US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has told Australia that it does not need to choose between the US, their most important security ally, and China, their primary trading partner. Is, as Clinton says, the Pacific really big enough?
I think so, and I think one has to ensure that the relationship is calibrated enough that there's recognition by the U.S. that China is in the Pacific, so it has a vested interest in what goes on there. And China, on the other hand, should understand that the U.S. has important allies and partners in the Pacific that gives it some vested interest in what goes on there. The big question is for those allies such as Australia. There's this natural tension between understanding the relationship with your economic partner, which is China, given the high dependence on Australia with its trading relationship with China, and on the other hand, it's a military relationship with the U.S., who it sees as a very close ally. And I think understanding the sensitivities around those two relationships, both for China and for the U.S., and the unique position that Australia is in, will make this a bit of a ticklish issue for all three players. And I think the same goes for Japan, for example, which sees the U.S. and Taiwan sees the U.S. as its security blanket, and China as its economic is the source of economic engine going forward. how this plays out, I think, will depend crucially on how China responds to America's assertiveness in the region, because that has been a feature of the global geopolitical landscape, and it will likely be that way over the next few decades or so. The U.S. is not going to renege on its obligation to its ally in the region, and so China has to understand, and perhaps as it becomes a more mature, developed nation, it will become more understanding of the fact that the U.S. will have a presence, though the U.S. Perhaps should also give way to a more assertive China in the region. But yes, there is room for both of them to remain important players to varying degree and to different extent based on the relationship that they have with the countries in the region.
And lastly, how has all of this been playing out on the US dollar yuan?
Well, I think what we've seen over the past year or so is a willingness on the part of China to allow its domestic currency to improve, to appreciate, and the reason for that is quite simple. China cannot continue to maintain a fixed exchange rate in the face of strong opposition from the U.S. and it's a an exchange rate arrangement that's incompatible with its own development goals. So what we expect to see over the next few years is a continued appreciation in Chinese yuan, which would provide some favorable boost to U.S. export activity. And on the other hand, as China orients its economic growth engine more domestically than externally, that is likely to help global economies such as the U.S. to export more to China. So this rebalancing in the relationship, in the economic relationship between China and the rest of the world, I think would be beneficial not only for the rest of the world, who would increase export activity to China, but also for China, whose people will see improvement in their well-being as consumption become a greater part of the economic well-being as opposed to investment, which has been the case over the past decade or so. That is investment and a focus on mercantile trade to the rest of the world. So over time, as this transition occurs, we can see the Chinese yuan beginning to rival that of the dominance of the U.S. Not in the very near term, but I think over time, if this maturity in the Chinese economy continues, if they continue progress towards liberalizing their financial system, towards liberalizing their legal system, towards modernizing their economy, I can see a China that not necessarily an equal footing with the U.S., but one that is increasingly more assertive globally, not only militarily but also economically. And I think that would be a good thing for both China and the rest of the world.
That's all for now. I'm Natalie MacDonald, and you've been watching Dukascopy TV. Stay tuned for more exclusive interviews.